Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I am your guest host, Nolan Johnson. Today's episode, Hitting the Road with Lewis and Clark. I got to sit down with Clay and talk about what he's looking forward to on our travels from the East Coast to the West Coast in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. We will start at Poplar Forest, May 6th, with a launch event, 2 p.m. Eastern. Come on out if you're able to get there. $25 to get into Poplar Forest. Come hang out here. What Clay is looking forward to. Help us out with a launch event. We'd love to see you out there. May 6th, 2 p.m. at Poplar Forest. That will be the launch event, and we will head and make stops at Monticello, Harpers Ferry, Philadelphia before jumping on the Ohio River at Pittsburgh, down to St. Louis on the Great Missouri River, back through our home state of North Dakota, the Wild West of Montana, all the way out to the West Coast, Astoria, Oregon. I'm looking forward to joining Clay as much as I can in some beautiful areas and seeing this great nation, parts that I have never seen before, with my own personal tour guide in Clay Jenkinson, creating a bunch of content for everybody. Visit ltamerica.org so you can find out how to become a friend of LTA, see everything that we have in bonus content, all sorts of extra videos, diary from Clay, extra content from myself as I travel out to meet him. Support our program in any way you can. Visit ltamerica.org to find out any way that works for you. On today's show, we discuss what we're looking forward to in this great adventure. And Clay asked the very serious question of what could go wrong? Well, we will find out. Stay tuned. Follow us on all the social medias. Visit ltamerica.org to figure out where we are. Follow us in real time. And stay tuned to the radio, the podcast, and all of the video content on YouTube and Facebook. Let's go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Listening to America. I am program editor, occasional guest host, Nolan Johnson. I am here today with the Clay Jenkinson, and we are talking about why Lewis and Clark. How you doing today, Clay?
Glad to be here. We just came from a lunch where we've been planning a whole series of Lewis and Clark related river adventures for the summer of 2025, because I think everybody knows I'm going to follow the entire Lewis and Clark Trail from about May 1st, 2025 until about November 15th, from Monticello, Jefferson's home in Virginia, all the way down the Ohio, up the Mississippi, up the Missouri, over the Bitterroot Mountains, down the Clearwater, Snake, and Columbia rivers to Astoria, Oregon, and then back again. I'll be hauling my 23-foot Airstream, and so we're planning some river activities, so we're not just driving along the Lewis and Clark River Trail, but getting on the river itself.
I'm really looking forward to the places that are around here that we're able to find a boat for ourselves and take it on our own, have our own adventure. You plan on doing this in more than one spot. What is the first place, do you think, when you're starting on the East Coast? Where do you think you'll be on the river for the first time?
The first time I know that I'll be on the river is at Cairo, Illinois, which is the mouth of the Ohio. So the Ohio comes down from the Alleghenies, forms the border between Ohio and Kentucky. And he finally empties into the Mississippi River itself at what looks like Cairo, as in Egypt, but is pronounced Cairo. And here's why I'm interested in this, Nolan. The river's 3.5 miles wide there. So we're talking about an immensity of water. The Mississippi dwarfs other rivers in its volume. It's one of the world's greatest rivers, and the Ohio comes there. And it's also important to me because in Huckleberry Finn, one of America's greatest books, when Huck and Jim are coming down the Mississippi, they're trying to get to Cairo because they're going to make a left turn there. And if they can get up the Ohio, Jim is in free territory, and presumably he escapes from slavery. They miss it in a fog, but it's been in my mind for 40 years, and I've seen it, I've driven past it, but I think it's going to be such an amazing experience to be out in a small boat on the Ohio as it empties into the Mississippi, just to get a feel of the power of the rivers.
How many of these rivers have you been on in the past?
Well, I've been on the Mississippi a little bit. Actually, during the bicentennial, I came down in the keel boat. It was part of a reenactment of Meriwether Lewis arriving in Memphis because, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but Lewis was sort of coming undone. He was having a slow nervous breakdown. He was on his way to Washington to try to repair his relations with the War Department and to explain his financial systems, which were very bizarre and fragmentary. And so he gets to Memphis, and the commanding officer at Fort Pickering there puts Lewis under house arrest because he was deranged and suicidal and toxic from both probably opium and certainly alcohol. And he had malaria, so far as we know, too. So he's in real trouble. And so we reenacted this during one of the signature events of the bicentennial. I was dressed up in buckskins, and we come to the place where you climb up these stairs to Fort Pickering, and then I was like staggering around and so on. So I've been on the Mississippi in that way, and I've been on the upper Mississippi in canoes and kayaks and so on in Minnesota. I've been on the Missouri all my life, of course, here in Bismarck, but also I'm around the Fort Mandan area, in the White Cliffs section of Montana, of course the Little Missouri River and the Yellowstone. But the reason I'm doing this is that I don't want this just to be a drive along. I've driven the Lewis and Clark Trail a couple of times. I'll be doing it in my Airstream, but I want to make sure, since it was a river voyage, that there are authentic river experiences. And the river that I'm most looking forward to, actually, is getting on the Ohio, because I've never been on the Ohio before. And it's kind of a neglected river because it was really before the expedition gets started. But Lewis was bringing the barge, the keelboat, all the way down from Pittsburgh, and so it's been a neglected part of the Lewis and Clark story.
Can you tell me a little bit about how being on the river, whether that means it's 50 yards away from the highway, or in some cases you're probably a mile or two away where you have to be on a highway to pull the Airstream. Can you talk about the different perspectives that you expect to see while you're actually on the water?
So one is sort of metaphysical. It's one thing to look at it and to be impressed by it. But when you get out there, it's a whole different experience. And every summer for the past almost 30 years, I've taken a group on the Lewis and Clark Trail in Montana, and we canoe on the famous White Cliffs section, which is near Fort Benton, Montana, for 3 days. And on the second day, when we leave camp, at a certain point I said, turn your canoes around and paddle upstream for 5 minutes. And a minute later, people are like, no, that could never happen. No, this is like, no, but they couldn't have done it. You realize the power of rivers. And so that's one thing, is that it's a completely different dynamic than being in a high-end internal combustion vehicle motoring on asphalt designed by great experts in highways. So that's part of it. There's a kind of a metaphysical difference. But also, you can't see what Lewis and Clark saw looking at the river. You can only see what they saw looking from the river. And so this is particularly interesting to me here in North Dakota, because when I get here to Fort Yates at the bottom of North Dakota on the Missouri, you and our friend Brian are going to meet me with a pontoon, and we're going to motor slowly against the current from Fort Yates to Cannonball, and from Cannonball to Fort Rice, and from Fort Rice to Mandan, and through Bismarck. It's probably a 3-day trip, but we'll be taking pictures of the bluffs on either side and the Cannonball coming in and other small creeks and so on from the river. I'll have the journals of the expedition. I edited Lewis and Clark for North Dakota back in 2003. This is a huge book that we produced. And I know the descriptions by Clark, and he's talking about all these things he sees on either side of the river, but when you drive along what's now a reservoir, Lake Oahe, you can't see them because you're right under them. You can't get distant enough to see what he was looking at. So this will be the first time, as far as I know, that anyone has actually tried to verify Clark's actual journal entries for that segment from the river. I couldn't be more excited, because I think that the reversing the lens from the asphalt to the river is going to be a key to the satisfaction of this great adventure this year, and it's also going to sort of open some new ground in Lewis and Clark studies.
Now, you edit the quarterly journal.
We proceeded on 4 times per year, about a 48-page glossy peer-reviewed journal.
And what do you think you and Brian and myself will be able to provide readers of that, real Lewis and Clark interested people, everyday people? What can we provide to them, do you think?
We'll certainly publish some of this. As editor, I'm going to take advantage of my position to publish. I'm going to publish previously unseen photographs from the river. I've asked you and Brian to keep a journal, at least an audio journal, so there'll be some comedy in this, I think. We're three very different personalities, and that's going to be part of the joy of all of this. There'll be sort of an article that I write about this, and I'm going to try to verify some things that Clark saw. For example, on a couple of occasions he said, "Oh, it looks like ancient fortifications." Well, we know that's not true. This is just the way the bluffs work. But I'm going to see those, and then I'm going to quote from the journals directly and show what he thought he saw and what he didn't see. They're also traveling through from Fort Yates, North Dakota to Bismarck. So that's the southern reach of the Missouri in North Dakota. They're traveling through classical Mandan country. But by the time they got here, the Mandan had moved way upriver to near Stanton and Washburn, North Dakota, about 45 miles north of Bismarck. They'd migrated for a number of reasons. It was Mandan traditional territory, Mandan sacred sites, Mandan village sites, and they were traveling with an Arikara man by the name of Tuni, and through interpreters, they were getting his commentary on Mandan traditions along the Missouri in the southern half of North Dakota. So that's a really rich area, and a couple of years ago, a map was discovered that I was able to print as a fold-out, and we proceeded on, of that same Arikara man's map of the Missouri country. So we'll carry that map with us too. So it'll be rich in all these ways, and even if it's not, earth-shattering discoveries, and I don't think it will be, it'll be new to almost everyone who reads this journal we proceeded on.
How, 200 plus years later, are there still discoveries being made along the trail and in a place like North Dakota where they spent much of their time, at least in the winters?
There's so much yet to be discovered, so from time to time new documents are discovered. And the last big cache was in the late 1980s in an attic in Louisville, where 54 letters of William Clark were discovered. They had a huge impact on the Lewis Clark story. Among these letters that Clark wrote to his brother Jonathan, had been in this attic for more than 100 years. Among these letters is one in which he talks about Lewis's suicide. So that's a very key document in Lewis and Clark studies. So documents get discovered. Campsites get discovered. Well, they camped everywhere, of course. And when they stayed more than a few days, they left more stuff behind. The most recent discovery was where something called Traveler's Rest was located near Missoula, Montana, and they discovered the exact location because of mercury deposits in the soil. Mercury was a chemical that was being used by Lewis to cure men of syphilis, other diseases, and so mercury passes through your body and accumulates in the latrines. And so when you find mercury out on the Lewis Clark Trail, they were probably there. So there's plenty left to discover. There are a number of significant mysteries of Lewis and Clark. But beyond that, Nolan, we now have the 13-volume definitive edition of the journals edited by the great Gary Moulton, University of Nebraska Press. Now that we have everything that everybody wrote under one cover of 13 volumes, people are going back and starting over, reading it as if they didn't know the story. And for the first time, we're reading it not to comb historical narrative out of it. On such and such a day, they killed a bear. On such and such a day, they met the Dakota. Now we're going and looking at them like literary texts and combing out small details that nobody has ever bothered really to notice before. So I'd say that we're in a new great era of Lewis and Clark discovery, and I'm so satisfied and delighted that I get to be a tiny part of it.
Great. And with that, we need to take a short break. When we come back, I will talk to Clay about why and how one becomes a Lewis and Clark scholar. We'll be right back with more Listening to America. Welcome back to Listening to America. This is editor and occasional co-host Nolan Johnson. I'm here talking with Clay Jenkinson about why Lewis and Clark. In 2025, we are traveling the Lewis and Clark Trail, creating media along the way, whether it be podcast or video. First, I want to touch on how does one become a scholar on a subject, and why Lewis and Clark?
I grew up in Dickinson, North Dakota, which is 100 miles west of the capital in Bismarck, town of, at the time, 13,000 people. North Dakota has a kind of a thin cultural history. And one of the biggest of all stories was that Lewis and Clark were here for more than 200 days, 213 days, I believe, the longest stay they had in any state, because they wintered here at a place they called Fort Mandan, up amongst a cluster of 5 Earth Lodge villages with a population of between 4,000 and 5,000 natives. So this was a really extraordinary place to winter. They built a crude compound they called Fort Mandan there, and they rested the men and wrote reports and had diplomatic encounters with native leaders and so on. So this was part of what every North Dakotan knows, that Custer died in Montana, but he started at Fort Lincoln in the summer of 1876. Lewis and Clark were here in 1804 and then again in 1806 briefly. So that's one thing, that you just grow up with it here. As you know, you grew up in Washburn, and Lewis and Clark is just part of the air we breathe in North Dakota. I was trained at the University of Minnesota and then at Oxford University in English Renaissance literature, the 17th century, John Donne, John Milton, later Shakespeare, and so on. And so this is a fair distance from my training. But when I came back to live here for a year between degrees, and I got involved with the North Dakota Humanities Council, and we decided we would really look into the Lewis and Clark story. And at that point, in a sense, I became a Lewis and Clark scholar. And how do you do it? You read. We have 13 volumes of the journals, probably 25 must-read books about Lewis and Clark. There are hundreds of books that touch on Lewis and Clark and the Lewis and Clark story in different ways. And so you begin by reading. But with a story like this, Nolan, it just begs you to get out there. And so I remember the first time I went to Fort Mandan, I was with my mother, and it was in the early 1970s. Then when I got more involved, I drove our 2 highways, 1804 and 1806. They're named after the 2 years that Lewis and Clark were here. You get glimpses of the Lewis and Clark world, but it's still at some distance. I've then, to get better at this, I've canoed whole sections of the Lewis and Clark Trail on the Missouri River and the Yellowstone. I've flown over parts of the Lewis and Clark Trail in a helicopter in Montana. I've flown hundreds of miles on the Lewis and Clark Trail in a Cessna Piper Cub. I've gone in an RV with a film company that was doing a documentary. And so you start to get in the scene. And then we've had a couple of winter encampments up at Fort Mandan, where we talk foolish people from Los Angeles and Seattle into coming and sleeping on the ground in the middle of January. Because no North Dakotan would be that stupid. But I did it twice, and they were great adventures. I can tell you that on one occasion it was the coldest night of my entire life. It was like 22 below, and I'm on a tarp out there in a sleeping bag and so on. But you really get a sense of how rugged the winter was. Not that any North Dakotan ever needs to be taught that. So I've really walked the walk on this over the years. So I've had decades doing this. And then about 6 years ago, I was asked to be the editor of the quarterly we proceeded on. And that has been an extraordinary experience for me. I've tried to revive it. It was sort of in steep decline. And I've tried to solicit new people to write about it, make new discoveries, have new perspectives. I'm also trying to convince the readers, the kind of this huge group of people that love everything about Lewis and Clark, that this is the 21st century, and we need to stop talking about Indians and start saying indigenous people, and we need to stop saying Indian brave and say a warrior. And a lot of our thinking, especially for people older than 50, was formed early when there was still kind of a white triumphalist view of Lewis and Clark, and now we have a much more diverse and multicultural view, which I think is very important. So I'm trying to lead our constituency into a more inclusive and more sensitive view of, especially of the contributions of Native people to the success of the expedition.
When you're in school and you're learning about this, whether it's in the early 2000s like I was or before that, you hear the terms manifest destiny, imperialism, things like that. How, in this day and age, during this travel, how do you approach people who have questions about topics like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Nolan. So one of the things I'm trying to do is not just look at Lewis and Clark. That'll be the primary focus of this journey. But I want to look at what I call the Europeanization of America. So Columbus bumps into the New World in 1492. At that time, 100% of it was native sovereignty, hundreds of tribes, more than 500 tribes, hundreds of different languages. By 1900, natives in their population had been reduced to about 200,000. I mean, amazing how low the native population got. It's come back considerably since then, and their land base had shrunk by over 95%. And so the process from 1492 to, say, 1942 was systematic dispossession of native peoples. That's the American story. We used to cheer about that and call it manifest destiny, as if God himself wanted the Anglo-Saxon people to take over the New World. We've seen through that now, and that doesn't mean we have to apologize or wring our hands or leave, sell our land, or give it back to natives and so on, although some of that is all good. What we do have to do now is to feel and to be willing to express our complicity in what happened. So we need to make sure that natives are at the table, that their voices are heard, that their oral traditions are respected, that their demands, and they have some, are listened to with great respect. It's a new era, and we can't be talking about this story in the way that we used to talk about it. Lewis and Clark, on the whole, get high marks because they were, on the whole, thoughtful and tolerant and generous. They didn't say, "We want your land," although we would eventually take it. They said, "We're here to spread the news of peace, that your commerce should be with us and not with the British and not with the Spanish and not with the French. We want you to live in peace with each other because your incessant warfare is incompatible with the peace we want in the American West. We have gifts, tokens of the kind of the trade items that will be coming up after us." So even though they're the spear point of empire, clearly, 1804 to 1806, they're the spear point of what Jefferson called an empire for liberty such as the world has never previously seen. For all of that, Nolan, they were still pretty good guys, and they weren't swashbuckling, and they weren't just mowing down natives who got in their way. On the whole, they were very respectful. And so as imperial moments go, they get pretty high marks. But we shouldn't forget that they thought they were the most important civilization that had ever existed, Lewis and Clark did, and that they represented the American Republic, and that the American Republic was the class act of world civilizations, and they frankly thought that native peoples were subordinate and that these native peoples would have to get out of the way. So I don't want to try to sugarcoat the tragic history of white Indian relations, of white native relations in American history, but Lewis and Clark do not take the same hit that some others take, as we have sort of a revisionist view of what exactly happened in this long conquest of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. So that's good, but I want to be honest about that, and one of my goals is to meet with as many indigenous people as possible. Lewis and Clark met more than 50 tribes. Most of them are still here, and I know some of these people, work with some of them, but I also want to hear native voices. And it's not always easy to hear those voices because in many respects, indigenous people have the right to be enraged by what has happened and continues to happen in our own time. And so listening without getting upset, without being tripped up, without being overreactive, just listening with respect is the first real breakthrough on all of this. And I try to do that as a writer, as an editor, and now I'll try to do it on the trail.
Do you think in 1800 Jefferson knew that this would be the expedition? Was it a blank canvas to them, and he knew Lewis and Clark would be the ones to do this, or would Would he be surprised that they're the sole, the focal point of westward expansion?
Oh, that's a terrific question. There's so many elements of it. First of all, canvas is the right word, because Jefferson wrote a letter in which he said these explorers that he was sending out, he said, they're beginning to fill the blank canvas. Just it'll take some time, but we're starting to figure out how the rivers work and where the mountain ranges are and what's available for agriculture and what isn't, and so on. So he used the word canvas very deliberately. He always called it the Lewis expedition. And this goes back to what I was just saying about this book by John Jengo. Jefferson sponsored Lewis for the American Philosophical Society, and Lewis was elected, very prestigious. He never promoted Clark for this, and in some ways Clark deserved it more than Lewis. But Jefferson couldn't really see William Clark's greatness. Jefferson had a kind of a bromance with George Rogers Clark, the older brother of William Clark, but he seemed to play down William Clark's excellence. So he called it the Lewis expedition. Did he think that we'd be talking about it? No. I'm sure he knew that it would be part of American history, because you only open up the wilderness once. You're only the first person in this zone, first white person in this zone once. But I think he would be surprised that we are as fixated on this as we are. I think he'd be pleased because, of course, that bears his signature. But I think he expected this to be interesting. When they came back in 1806, they're coming back down the Missouri River, and they inevitably met people going up, so traders and trappers who were on their way out of St. Louis heading up to trade with native people. They met more than 100 people, boats, coming upriver as they returned to St. Louis, and the first thing they learned was, hey, everybody thought you guys just disappeared into the world. Everyone thought you were dead. I mean, so we didn't even know you were still around. And that's one thing, that people thought they were dead. So there's a bit of a surprise that they had survived. And the second thing is that, it's often said, oh, Lewis and Clark opened the doors to the west, but those doors were open already. There were trappers going up. If Lewis and Clark had perished out there, it wouldn't have slowed down anything for even a month. Americans, at this time especially, were obsessed with wealth making. Here was this new territory that had infinite numbers of beaver. That's money in the bank if you can go trap them and bring them back to St. Louis. These natives were so starved for white provisions like pieces of metal, cloth, trade beads, frankly alcohol, that you could trade a tiny thing like a 4-inch piece of metal for 20 bushels of corn. So there was a that really bothers me, that white people are always taking trinkets into the wilderness like a little mirror, and they get a buffalo skin for it because the natives didn't have mirrors. And so I suppose it's a fair trade in some sense, but it feels so exploitative to me. But anyway, these things would get worked out over time. But as we look in retrospect, we're trained at this point in our history to see the dark side, the disillusioned side, the exploitative side, the conquest, and so on. And that's really important, but it can't be the only story. There's still so much about the Lewis and Clark story that's thrilling and admirable and fascinating. There's just no other story like it. So you have John C. Fremont, who was an amazing explorer. There are people who love what he did, but there's no national obsession with the Fremont expeditions or the Pike expeditions or the Custis expedition. This is Lewis and Clark, and so I'm really fortunate to give a significant portion of my career to this subject.
Is it just because I grew up in North Dakota, or is the Lewis and Clark expedition a focal point of every state they went through, or North Dakota because they spent so much time here, or me because I grew up in Washburn and was right on Fort Mandan location?
Well, you did grow up in Washburn, so you're right there. And you grew up during the bicentennial,
right,
when it was a hot commodity. At one point, the late Stephen Ambrose said 1 in 10 Americans will get out on the Lewis and Clark Trail. Well, it didn't exactly turn out that way, but it was a huge thing. But also, we're not the most important state. The state that claims Lewis and Clark is Montana, those vile Montanans. And they lord it over everybody else. It is true that some of the greatest adventures of the expedition occurred in Montana, particularly from Great Falls to the Idaho border. But they regard themselves as as the class act of the Lewis and Clark story. South Dakota gets short shrift. Oregon does pretty well because it's Fort Clatsop. But if you think of the Lewis and Clark Trail, it's Montana. And I should say, too, though, they deserve it. The signage is better there than we have it in North Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
In Montana, it's just much more isolated and much more pristine. So I'm afraid you're the product of growing up right next to the fort.
See, I always thought North Dakota was where all the good things along the trail happened. You know, they spent the winters here. They seemed to make the most friends here.
If you grow up in North Dakota, you have one advantage over everybody else forever. We had Sacagawea.
Right.
They met Sacagawea here. She was the wife of this kind of rascally trader named Toussaint Charbonneau. They meet her on November 4th, 1805 at the construction site of Fort Mandan. Within days, Lewis and Clark hire Charbonneau to come with them, and he's going to help them because he pitched himself. He was an extraordinary human being. I know he's usually regarded as an idiot and a buffoon, and he was all that, but he was also really remarkable in some ways. He was a survivor and an opportunist. And they're building this fort, and he comes to them and says, hey, you guys are going to want an interpreter. I happen to speak Hidatsa, and you're going to need me. And if you hire me, I'll make things better for you. And they realized, we do need that interpreter. Mm-hmm. So they hire him. Then he says, and by the way, if you're going to go over the mountains, you're going to need horses. I've got these 2 wives. You take us along. When you get out there, they'll help you get the horses. And Lewis and Clark said, okay. They take them along, and by Godfrey, they get down there, and she does help them, and they played a significant role. And I've said this all my life, Nolan. No Sacagawea, no Lewis and Clark. You take her out of this story, I feel certain we wouldn't be sitting here.
Wow,
isn't that amazing?
Yeah,
that's. And when I do this for white audiences, and I know you're going to cop to this. I get in front of a white audience, and I'll say, close your eyes and picture Sacagawea. Right? And then I give that like 5 seconds. I say, what did you see? And they're like, nothing. And then I say, you saw Miss Indian America, didn't you? You saw this beautiful woman in this pristine buckskin dress. She's lean and beautiful and has pigtails. And then you realize, well, what would it be like camping with this woman on day like 82 when no one's had a bath, no one brushes their teeth? She probably didn't look like Miss Indian America, but that's a fantasy, the Pocahontas fantasy. Mm-hmm. And the 2 most famous Native American women in American history are Pocahontas and Sacagawea. And what do they share? They share that they helped white people take the continent, right?
John Smith, yeah.
They're not Crazy Horse saying, no way, we're going to fight you every second of the day, or Red Cloud. They're saying, yes, we'll help you. Yes, take us along. But she was an accommodationist rather than part of the resistance. And so that's, if she had been part of the resistance, we wouldn't know about her.
Great. With that, we need to take a short break. We will be back. We will talk about our plans for 2025, some of the mysteries that Clay hopes to seek out along the trail. We'll be right back with more Listening to America. Welcome back to Listening to America. I am your co-host for today and editor of the program, Nolan Johnson. I'm here with Clay Jenkinson. Today we had lunch with our friend Brian Jackson. We were discussing a specific segment of the Lewis and Clark Trail where we are going to take a pontoon down to near the North and South Dakota border, travel upstream for near 70 river miles.
With outboard motor.
In a pontoon, with food, with a tent, with a sleeping bag.
And a satellite phone.
Yeah, all the necessary provisions. And we will make our way up to the capital city of Bismarck, North Dakota. What sprouted this as an idea in your mind? Why that section of the Missouri River? And am I going to make it through 3 nights on the Missouri River?
Serious doubts. I'll come back to my doubts about whether you can make it. I came away from our lunch today a little worried about both of you, frankly. So we're going in a pontoon. That sounds a little bourgeois already. It's a pontoon trip, really heroic.
With breakfast.
No canoes, with food and coolers, Yeti coolers, and an outboard motor and satellite phones and so on. but we're going to do it. And so it's been in my mind for a very long time. And I've just been waiting for idiots that will do it with me. Finally,
It barely took you any time to convince us.
No, I mean, I mentioned it a few months ago, and you're like, yeah, we're in. And then Brian found us a pontoon, and it's going to be great. Brian is a great guy, and everyone's getting to know you. And you're our videographer, so you've met me on the trail all through the Steinbeck world, and it's going to be a bigger deal in this year. So for many, many years, I've wanted to travel from Fort Yates up to Bismarck on the river, because you can only see things that Clark saw from the river. You can't see them from the roads. And he talks about all these bluffs and ancient fortifications and abandoned village sites and so on. And I've never been able to get at them because the roads don't get close enough. And so and the river's been dammed. It's wide. It's 4, 5, 8 miles wide in some places down there. And so we're going to take this pontoon and move around and take a gazillion photographs and have the journals with us and maps of different sorts and GPS units and depth finders and a drone and your video cameras and so on. So we're going to really capture this. It's never been done. The only thing like it was William Least Heat Moon's book, The River Horse, which he wrote during the bicentennial, and he made a river trip along the entire trail. But it's sort of geared in a different way. This is more nerdy, more straight for Lewis and Clark. So that's one adventure. We're also going to look for Fort Mandan. Don't want to say too much about that, but Fort Mandan has been gone for a long time, presumably washed away by the Missouri River that gouges new channels all the time. I think I know where it is. I have a friend who showed me where it must be. Brian has some knuckleheaded theory of where it's supposed to be. We'll see. But he's been there more recently than I have. And so we'll do that. Last year, you and Brian and I took a fishing boat to the mouth of the Little Missouri River, which is under Lake Sakakawea. Mm-hmm. And I've always wanted to get there because I have a special sort of personal fascination, kind of a spiritual ownership of the Little Missouri River. And I wanted to see its mouth because when Lewis and Clark describe it on April 13th, 1805, it just sounds like it was so magnificently beautiful. It's big Badlands country there. And they said they could stand up at the mouth of the Little Missouri right next to the big river itself. And I thought I would give anything for that moment. Well, it's never going to happen because of the dam. But we went out with depth finders and discovered, because I had written a footnote in my edition of Lewis and Clark in North Dakota saying, I think it's probably about 75 feet deep here. Mm-hmm. I was working from a very small database on that, and there was some guessing. Turns out that was about right, but I wanted to get that point, and I wanted to take pictures from the mouth of the Little Missouri in every direction. It's hard to get good pictures because the lake is just so
You're a long way
wide there. But we went into a kind of a cove.
Yeah.
And that was spectacular. Mm-hmm. So that's one. Then you're going to meet me in Montana for the White Cliffs section. So every year I lead a cultural tour through the White Cliffs section of the Missouri from Fort Benton down to something called Judith Landing. And you and Brian are going to come and we're going to get some drone footage. And there are 3 or 4 places there that I really want to get great video of and still photography of and drone footage of. And we'll be recording programs in all of these adventures. We'll be recording our hijinks. And then when we get down on the bottom of the Columbia, I'll be there, and I'll be there alone until you come. And then when you fly out, I want to rent a boat or get on an excursion boat and spend some time at the mouth of the Columbia. I've done that 2 or 3 times before, but never with a competent videographer. In the Steinbeck trip, it was kind of a shakedown tour with the Airstream. Mm-hmm. Can I live in an Airstream? Can I work in an Airstream? Even more importantly, what kind of pace can you go on? What is RV life like? I've done some of it in the past, but I've never done it with a thematic purpose. And Steinbeck didn't stop much. He was just kind of rolling along. With Lewis and Clark, this is a story I know inside and out. I'm not probably the greatest Lewis and Clark scholar in the country, certainly not, but I'm one of the most well-informed Lewis and Clark scholars in the country, and one of the few who just wants to get out there, and have adventures. And so I can't wait. This is going to be like a culmination of 30 years of reading and hard work. As you know, I have several books on the subject. My edition of Lewis and Clark in North Dakota, which I'm immensely proud of, published in 2003, with 600 footnotes about their time here. And I wrote a big book. My big book is called The Character of Meriwether Lewis, Explorer in the Wilderness. I'm immensely proud of that. I think that's probably my greatest contribution to scholarship. I've been editing this journal comes out 4 times a year now for 6 years. I'm deep in this story, and I've portrayed Meriwether Lewis over the years, and had all those other adventures with helicopters and planes and so on. So I feel like this is going to be a kind of a capstone to a life of traveling in Lewis and Clark. And 3 years ago, I wouldn't have expected this to happen, Nolan. Then when it did happen, thanks to some wonderful benefactors, especially on the Airstream front, I decided to do Shakedown first with Steinbeck because that made so much sense. And then I thought Lewis and Clark, and it would have been an interesting journey. But then where you come in, and Brian too, but especially you, now we're talking about documenting this in some really extraordinary ways. And there will be some humor, of course. There will be misadventures, of course. I mean, Brian's already whining about breakfast, for goodness sakes. What kind of, he wouldn't last 13 hours on the Lewis and Clark Trail. We're in a position to create our own documentary of a different kind. And I'm going to try to interview native voices along the way. I'll do some of that. You'll do some of that. I'm also going to interview the great Lewis and Clark scholars that I have access to along the way. And here's one more thing. I don't just want to take pictures of beauty spots on the Missouri River.
Sure.
That's important. But that is so unrepresentative. I want to picture the whole Lewis and Clark Trail as I wish it would be and as it actually is. And I don't want it to be squalid in any way or some sort of ironic revisionist view or postmodern view, but I want to tell the story as it actually exists. And one of my goals is to be able to write a report on the health of the trail. What are the threats to the trail? What's going on that's being built out there? So I want to do a kind of state of the trail report as I do everything else. So there are many different agendas. And my friend Russ, Russ Eagle, the famous Russ, has encouraged me to write a journal in the manner of Meriwether Lewis, which I'm going to do using his heretofore this and his Lewis language. And I just ordered from this woman at the Library of Congress, who's a friend of mine. She makes journals. So she contacted me a few years ago and said, I've made an authentic Lewis and Clark journal out of elk skin and old paper and sewing it and so on. And so then we did an article about it and we proceeded on. And then she offered to help people if they wanted to do this. And I've been trying to get her, a gig at one of the big conferences and people would sign up. But I wrote to her 2 weeks ago and I said, Kathleen, would you be willing to make me a journal? I don't have time, probably don't have talent. So she's making me this authentic 5x7 leather-bound, vintage paper, hand-sewn journal for this trip. It's gonna. I hate to even write it. It's gonna be so lovely. But you see my point. I'm trying to have a multi-leveled approach to all of this, and you're going to play a key role in it, not only as the videographer and co-host and so on, but you're going to. You and Brian and I are going to drown on day one just north of Fort Yates. Yeah, that'll be tough. That'll be tough. So we're going to start in this pontoon. And I know pontoon sounds a little goofy, but it's actually the smart way to do this.
Yeah, it floats a little bit.
Floats a little higher.
When we're dealing with sandbars, we're going to need...
It's a little more stable for taking photographs and launching the drone. And we have access to one, which is amazing. And then we'll sleep on sandbars. And I'll tell you, I've done this. You've done this. There's nothing like... This will be at the end of June. There's nothing like a day around July 4th when you're on a sandbar and it's 92 degrees but zero humidity, and you lie down on a sandbar. Maybe you drink a beer, maybe you just have water, and you kind of doze off for a little while, and then you open your eyes, and there's that kind of that like Polaroid effect. Your eyes take a while to adjust to the incredible intensity, and the heat is so great. It's not baking you. You're not overheated because you can jump in the river at any time. But the heat, there's this kind of, this is what July on the Great Plains can be. It's a magnificent moment, and we'll see eagles. There won't be many people. This is a really remote part of the world. We'll be taking lots and lots of photographs, but we won't let it get in the way. And I believe that it'll be one of the extraordinary experiences of my 2025 Lewis and Clark Trail. The other one that I'm really looking forward to is to get to Great Falls on July 4th, because they were there on July 4th, 1805. They were portaging their stuff around the 5 waterfalls there, and that was the day they ran out of whiskey. So they had carried a ton of whiskey, I mean, almost literally a ton of whiskey from St. Louis, but they inevitably ran out because Army privates were entitled to a glass of whiskey per day. They ran out there, so I thought, where would I rather be on the 4th of July, 2025 than at Great Falls? And I'll go to there's a giant springs there, and I'll go there and I'll have a small quantity of whiskey, and I'll finish it, and that'll be that.
That'll be great. I know I need to do this because I'm anxious about it.
You better start training.
Why, I don't know. I've been, if it's traveling with LTA or other projects that we're working on, I'm an indoor cat, is what I told Brian. Brian he's made for this. He's a spear fisherman, single breath hold, spear fisherman, catches walleye.
You're really building him up here.
But that's what Brian is.
He actually is kind of
he's
a specimen of human masculine strength.
He is, and he's an outdoorsman. He's a fisherman. He's a hiker.
Right.
He appreciates the bluffs. He finds buffalo skulls.
What's he doing with us? Is the question. Yeah.
And I stay in a hotel and shoot video. And
you've become a little soft from your famous days. And it's not that you're overweight or anything, but you're just not. You're not quite the hero that I thought you were going to be.
I am soft.
But you're married. You have 2 children. You have a very very detailed life.
Yeah, I'm a cuddly father of 2 daughters. That's what I look like, and
That's
so
not true.
I need to get out of
this.
I need to get out of my comfort zone.
Yes.
Even today while we were talking about it, it's like, okay, I start running through my head of, okay, well, what if there's an emergency? What if there's
at lunch we're talking about this, and it was so disillusioning to me because first there was the incident of the breakfast, and Brian was like having a nervous breakdown, and then I said, you said in kind of a whiny voice, well, where will we sleep? I said, well, I'll throw her on a sandbar. You said, a sandbar? Can we sleep on the pontoon? So I feel like, Jesus, you guys. Is it Lewis and Clark?
This is so far removed. This is why it's good.
This is exactly what happened.
Because this is so far removed from the Tempur-Pedic bed that I sleep in
the tunable bed.
Yeah.
So we're going to go on this adventure, and then we're going to find Fort Mandan. We're going to break that news to the world, and and there's that moment on the White Cliffs section where you wake up and you turn out to have been in a Carl Bodmer painting. I've been there many times and tried to get it, and you're going to bring the drone, and we're going to find exactly where he was sitting with his easel as he painted one of the most famous pictures of the upper Missouri. So this is not just adventure. This is really going to be amazing, I think pioneering work in some respects.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. And what's this place called? It's the place where you say you take camp for the night.
It's Eagle Camp.
You take off from Fort Benton.
And you're in Eagle Camp, so you go 14 miles the first day, or 12. Stop at this Eagle Camp. It's a preferred campground, so there's a fire pit, and there are vault toilets and so on. And the tents are all set up. It's sort of modified limited glamping. And in the morning, you get up and you get in the canoes, and it turns out that you were actually camping in this famous painting. And I had this laminated picture around for people to see, and they're like amazed that we camped in a famous painting of the American West. And I've been there trying to figure it out. I've taken a zillion pictures there. But with a drone, you should be able to maneuver that drone holding in one hand the painting and then the other hand running the drone. You should be able to get it as close as we're ever going to get to the perspective that he was using. And I think he fudged it a little, as artists do, of course. But you're going to be, when you see it, you're going to think, oh, this was worth this trip just for this moment.
That name sticks in my head.
Carl
Bodmer, just attached to any Lewis and Clark knowledge that I still may have
I promise
from my interpretive days.
Unlike, Brian, who's jaded and just wants food, you still have a sense of wonder. And when we get to that spot in the painting, maybe we'll leave him behind at breakfast and he can catch up. But when you get to that spot, you're going to say, oh my goodness, I am thrilled to be able to see where this painting was painted, because people can look it up. Just look up the Stone Gates, Carl Bodmer. Truly remarkable, because the river, the White Cliffs on both sides, they're about 150 yards apart. But when you get a little downstream, it looks like the gates close, like they shut. And that's why he called it the Stone Gates.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
All right, we've got 1 minute left. I just want a real quick question just for my own curiosity. What is your favorite section of the Lewis and Clark Trail?
I'm going to nominate just two quickly. One is the White Cliffs. On the second day, and it's usually Russ and I in a canoe, we get ahead of everybody because people chatter about their insurance, about their cousins and their children, their grandchildren, they want to go to the Galapagos, they want to build a cabin. And I say, just shut up, everyone, just shut up. And so Russ and I get a little ahead. He's the quietest person you can imagine on the river, so at a certain point we just stop. And we take the paddles into the canoe, and we just drift down the river, let the river take us towards the Gulf of Mexico. And it's 85 degrees, and you just feel like, A, it's summertime and the living is easy, and B, it doesn't get any better than this. That's one. The other one is on the Clearwater River one in the mountains on US Highway 12 in Idaho. And now you're on the western slope and you're heading towards the Pacific, and these are very different rivers. It's not yet the massive Snake or the massive Columbia. It still has kind of a manageable size, and you just think, for a mountain scene, there's nothing more beautiful. There are many beautiful mountain scenes in the world. There can't be one that's more beautiful than this. And so those are my two favorite places on the water.
Beautiful. Well, we will end it there. I want to invite everybody to come along on this journey in 2025 with Clay Jenkinson and Listening to America. Follow along, ltamerica.org, all of our social channels. Tell us what you want us to show you on the trail in 2025. Thank you so much, Clay.
We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.